Do you think you've become some kind of superhero emerging from the shadows? Chris sneered, looking down on us. Beside me, Sherry was trembling in fear, surrounded by 5 gang members. Their leader, Trevor, was breathing heavily, laying down the law. But the moment he heard my name, Trevor's demeanor suddenly changed. Confused by this unexpected reaction, Chris raised his voice, attempting to incite the gang to attack us. However, Trevor, irritated by Chris, turned his back on us and glared at Chris, who arrogantly stood behind him. Chris, unaware of my relationship with Trevor, must have thought he could use the gang to harass me. Because of this, he overstepped his bounds and cornered himself into a dire situation. My name is Dave, and at 36, I have a somewhat unusual background. During my school years, I clashed with others daily, convinced I had no allies. Although sometimes mocked for my height, no one could match me, the strongest of them all. I've had my share of trouble with the law, but only one person, Officer Kevin, genuinely cared for me. "You need to be kinder to people now that you're an adult," Kevin would say, always looking out for me and calming me down whenever I caused trouble. It was Kevin who introduced me to the military, a path I had never considered during my uncertain future. After enlisting, confident in my physical abilities, I was recognized by my superiors and underwent special training. I began reevaluating my life, working hard to study, something I had never done before, hoping to be of some use to others. Years later, after rising to a position where I was in charge of a unit, I was assigned to a Special Forces team. After completing numerous missions, I longed for a normal life and retired from the Special Forces, taking a job at a regular company. The company I joined was a small foreign trade firm dealing directly with international transactions and mediating between companies. Occasionally, I had to deal with individuals who couldn't show their faces in broad daylight. Knowing my background, Mr. Thompson, the president of the company, hired me as both an employee and a bodyguard. Despite not being a fan of formalities, I found the daily routine of wearing a suit and working on a computer suited me. This mundane life felt fulfilling in its own way, and I had no complaints about my job, except for one unbearable aspect: Chris, my younger, taller boss. Boasting about his prestigious university degree, Chris looked down on me, a high school graduate from the lower ranks. His attitude was infuriating. "Hey, you're a high school grad, right? It's amazing you got into this company at your age. Must have been your first job, huh? You must have lived a worthless life until now, right?" he would say, taunting me. Indeed, I am a high school graduate, but having served in the military and special forces, I pride myself on my unmatched life experience. Enduring Chris's endless and impressive college tales was unbearable. Not going to college means you've missed out on life, but I guess someone who's only experienced the bottom of the barrel like you can't even imagine that. I couldn't accept that such a worthless man was managing a team as a boss. Sherry, my direct supervisor and the senior manager, always laughed off Chris's pompous behavior and irritation toward me. "Don't worry about it, we just need to do our job." Feeling a familiar kindness in Sherry, I was surprised to find out she was the daughter of my mentor, Kevin. While talking about Kevin, Chris, looking displeased, slammed my desk hard. "Having fun with my Sherry, even though you're just a high school grad? You're 10 years too early for that." An irritated Chris dumped a mountain of work on me and left. Sherry looked at me worriedly. "Is this okay?" "It's a lot. Compared to the operations in the Special Forces, this is nothing," I reassured her. Handling paperwork wasn't a big deal, but having spent over a decade in the isolated world of Special Forces, I lacked the manners and rules of a civilian. Without Sherry's support, I couldn't even properly set up meetings for outside sales. Sherry, though higher in position, was much younger in age. Her gestures of gently calming me were reminiscent of a parent-child relationship and felt nostalgically familiar. Every time Sherry joined me on outside visits, Chris would glare at me with jealous rage, grinding his teeth. It was obvious to anyone who saw it that Chris had set his sights on Sherry. Indeed, Sherry, with her beautiful looks and bright personality, was well regarded by the staff and incredibly attractive. Uncomfortable with his advances, Sherry tried to keep her distance, but Chris, undeterred, would seize any opportunity to approach her. "I found a great place. Let's go out for dinner, just the two of us, tonight," he would say. Unable to bear it any longer, I grabbed Chris's hand as he attempted to touch a distressed Sherry. "Ouch! What are you doing?" Can't you see Sherry is troubled? And touching a woman without consent is a big issue these days, isn't it? Do you even know who you're talking to? Unlike bottom-rung employees like you, I'm a manager, Chris boasted arrogantly, as if his position justified his behavior. To me, it didn't matter what position he held. Sherry was the daughter of my mentor, and if she was in trouble, it was only right to help her. Chris tried to shake off my hand and landed a strong punch to my stomach. But such an attack hardly made an impact on my trained body. I feigned pain to appease him, and Chris sneered at me triumphantly. I'll let it go for today. Just don't ever get in the way of me and Sherry. He left in a good mood that time, but to protect Sherry, I continued to interfere with Chris's tyranny time and again. Then, one day, I was suddenly summoned by the department head, Alex. It seemed Chris had been feeding Alex all sorts of stories. Although I couldn't agree with being reprimanded, I kept apologizing. Unlike Sherry, who came to console me after the lecture, Chris came to gloat. After all, a useless person like you is just dead weight to the company. Just quit already. Causing trouble here would only burden Sherry and Mr. Thompson, who had hired me. As much as I wanted to retaliate, I had no choice but to let Chris's insults slide. As I continued to intervene to keep Chris away from Sherry, my desk began to pile up with the work he dumped on me daily. The volume of tasks increased over time, and soon I was so buried in busy work that I couldn't even make the last train home, let alone leave on time. I'm making a useful employee out of a bottom rung like you. Be grateful, Chris sneered. Sherry, worried about me, offered her help, but before we knew it, it was past midnight. Seeing the time, Sherry suddenly smiled. It's too late now, can't be helped. Let's grab some dinner and then take a taxi home. I couldn't refuse Sherry's invitation, nor should I let her go home alone. All right, as a thank you for helping me with the work, dinner's on me tonight. Sherry's childlike expression of joy, such a stark contrast to her usual beauty, felt incredibly endearing. The pleasant time flew by quickly, and I left Sherry in front of the restaurant to look for a taxi on the main street. Just as a taxi pulled up, I heard Sherry scream. Rushing back, I found her surrounded by 5 large men. What are you guys doing? I demanded. We'll deal with the guy later. Miss, would you come with us? One of them said, his hand grabbing Sherry. I brushed his hand off, and he glared at me with a demonic expression. Hey, who do you think you are? Don't you know me? I'm Trevor, the gang leader around here. The gang Trevor claimed to lead was one that Mr. Thompson had warned me about, and Trevor was their young leader. His large build and sharp eyes would make any ordinary person flee, but no matter who the opponent was, I couldn't back down. It doesn't matter who you are. If you lay a hand on her, I won't hold back. Facing Trevor, his fist flew toward me with resolve. I thought I could handle the attack, but it was tough to bear. After several hits, I seized a moment's gap, grabbed Sherry's hand, and attempted to escape. But there were 5 of them. They weren't going to let us go that easily. Cut off from any escape, I deflected their attacks when a familiar voice echoed from the shadows of a building. What are you doing? Hurry up and finish him off. Emerging from hiding was none other than Chris. Standing before us, Chris arrogantly spouted selfish remarks. Hey, you think you're some kind of hero? You're no match for Trevor and his crew. Stay away from my Sherry. Chris, convinced of his absolute superiority, looked down on me with a smug grin. Facing 5 opponents, I had no way out, and even I couldn't protect Sherry under these circumstances. Paralyzed with fear, Sherry trembled, unable to move. In this dire situation, I racked my brain for a solution but came up empty, falling right into Chris's trap. However, upon closer inspection, Trevor's face looked familiar. Wondering if it could be him, I introduced myself. Could you be Trevor? I am Trevor. What do you mean by could you be? Do you think you'll be allowed to act like that? Irritated by my words, Trevor frowned and glared at me condescendingly. Do you recognize me? I'm David. The moment I introduced myself, Trevor's eyes widened and his face turned pale. In a panic, Trevor started apologizing profusely, right there in the middle of the road. Wait, you're David? I'm terribly sorry for my ignorance and disrespect. Hey, you all apologize too. Shaken by Trevor's sudden erratic behavior, the rest of the group hastily apologized. Sherry, stunned by Trevor's bizarre actions, managed to stop trembling. Above Chris's astonished face floated numerous question marks. David. What on earth? Dumbfounded by Trevor's repeated apologies, Sherry looked back and forth between us. Losing patience with Trevor and his crew's inexplicable fear, Chris started yelling at them. Trevor, what are you doing? Hurry up and teach this guy a lesson. Shut up. Do you even know who this man is? David here used to lead the gang that ran this area, and I owe him a lot. Someone like you has no right to speak lightly of him. Before meeting Kevin, I used to vent my frustrations by causing trouble. And that's when I met Trevor. Trevor, who was young at the time, suddenly came to me, wanting to be my disciple. Initially reluctant, I eventually started taking care of him, who would always follow me around. This odd relationship with Trevor somewhat changed something in me. I never expected to reunite with him in such a manner. Trevor kept apologizing, but confused by his sudden turnabout, Chris still ordered them to attack me and Sherry. Who cares about the past? You said you'd listen to me, so do it now. Despite Chris's harsh words, Trevor defiantly glared back at him. Unable to comprehend Trevor's actions, Chris stood there, absent-mindedly scratching his head. Suddenly, he pulled something shiny and sharp from his jacket's inner pocket and lunged at me, screaming. Easily dodging Chris's attack, I grabbed his hand and knocked the dangerous object to the ground. What are you even doing? Stay away from Sherry, I warned. Trevor, you're useless to me. Enraged, Chris hurled insults at Trevor and his crew, but they remained unfazed. Letting go of his arm, Chris stumbled and fell to the ground. Getting up while glaring at me fiercely, he spat, Remember this, you'll pay for defying me. Looking around in panic, Chris continued to loudly insult me and Trevor's crew. Then, holding his arm in pain, he fled the scene. Sherry, having witnessed everything, looked at me with a face that couldn't hide her astonishment. I didn't want Sherry to know about my past, but in this situation, I had no choice but to explain. Taking a deep breath, I slowly shared my story with her. Truth be told, I didn't always live a life I could be proud of. It was during such times that I met your father. As I recounted how I met Kevin, Sherry's face lit up with understanding and relief. Confused by her unexpected reaction, Sherry began to speak with a joyful smile. So it was you. I heard stories from my father, and I'm glad to see you're just as kind and straightforward as I imagined. It seemed Sherry had heard about me directly from Kevin himself. Despite the trouble I had caused, learning that Kevin had spoken fondly of me made me feel somewhat bashful. As Sherry and I shared this indescribable moment, Trevor approached apologetically. David, I truly apologize for today. You've become a fine adult, different from before. I'm impressed all over again. Trevor's subordinates, confused by his reaction, kept their distance, watching the situation unfold. They must be wary of me now, a mysterious figure to whom Trevor has apologized. David, let me make it up to you by driving you home. And please, miss, join us as well. Gratefully accepting Trevor's offer, I got into the car he guided us to. As I relaxed, thinking this was a moment to catch my breath, Sherry looked at me with sparkling eyes. David, I don't know the details, but you were in some incredible places, weren't you? Do you have amazing muscles or something? Even after retiring, I haven't skipped my daily training routines. With a body fat percentage of 5%, my physique, maintained through consistent training and exercise, is indeed extraordinary. Sherry's fascination with muscles seemed to erase any fear she had from the earlier attack. Though the conversation took an unexpected turn, I was relieved to see Sherry's spirits lifted. After ensuring her safe return home, Trevor also drove me to my place. As we were about to part ways, Trevor stepped out of the car to speak to me. David, if there's anything I can do for you, just let me know. And about that Chris, it seems he holds quite a grudge against you. The information Trevor shared about Chris was astonishing. The next day, I walked into the office to be met by a furious Chris. He wasted no time grabbing my suit, glaring down at me with an intense scowl. Desperate to assert his dominance, Chris started bragging about his past, as if trying to intimidate me. Yesterday was just a mistake, right? I was part of a tough gang back in high school. There's no way I'd be scared of someone like you. Chris's words were meant to rattle me, but they fell flat. It was clear that he had met Trevor during college through a mutual acquaintance, but from what I gathered, they weren't exactly equals. Chris seemed more like a lackey than a friend to Trevor. Yet he strutted around, boasting about having Trevor as his protector. Annoyed by his posturing, I calmly shrugged off his grip and made a call, putting my phone on speaker. "Trevor, are you free to talk?" Chris's confident facade crumbled the moment Trevor's voice came through the speaker, warm and familiar. "Always happy to hear from you, David." Chris froze, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected me to contact Trevor so easily. Ignoring his stunned expression, I continued, "Trevor, can you confirm what happened yesterday? It was all true, right?" "Yes, Chris was the one who paid us to attack you and your friends. His reckless behavior, pretending to be a gang leader, has been quite a nuisance." Chris, panicking, tried to end the call, but it was too late. Several employees had already gathered in the office, drawn by the commotion. Their cold, disdainful gazes were now fixed on Chris. "This is a lie. I don't know anything about this. David must be forcing him to say these things." Chris stammered, desperately trying to defend himself. But Trevor continued exposing Chris's actions, leaving him pale and trembling. As he collapsed to his knees, covering his ears in denial, Mr. Thompson, the company's senior manager, appeared. After hearing from the nearby employees about Chris's misdeeds, Mr. Thompson sighed deeply, looking at Chris with disappointment. "Chris, is this true?" "Well, this is." Chris struggled to form a coherent excuse, but under Mr. Thompson's stern gaze, he finally crumbled. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're apologizing to the wrong person, aren't you?" Mr. Thompson's voice was firm, his patience wearing thin. Resigned, Chris turned to me, swallowing his pride. "David, I'm sorry. But it was too little, too late." Mr. Thompson, his face weary with disappointment, immediately stripped Chris of his managerial position, demoting him all the way down to a regular employee. The office buzzed with surprise at Mr. Thompson's decisive action. Days after the incident, Chris seemed to have finally realized the gravity of his behavior. He stopped making unreasonable demands and dropped his arrogant attitude toward the juniors. However, whenever our paths crossed, Chris would nervously glance my way before quickly retreating. He rarely initiated conversations anymore. But one day he approached me, his expression a mix of nervousness and the smugness he once had. "David, you're just a high school graduate, right? Can you even speak French?" He smirked, clearly expecting me to fail. It seemed he had received a call from a client who only spoke French and assumed I wouldn't be able to handle the conversation. But thanks to the rigorous training I'd undergone before joining the Special Forces, I was fluent in French. Handling the client's inquiries was no problem at all. As I smoothly wrapped up the conversation, the surrounding employees looked at me with admiration, leaving Chris dumbfounded. Speaking French was nothing extraordinary for someone with my background, but it clearly caught everyone else by surprise. "Isn't this normal?" I thought to myself, puzzled by their reactions. Apparently, Chris, who had always boasted about his education and looked down on others, was known among the employees as an incompetent college graduate, particularly for his lack of language skills. Indeed, Chris's attempt at speaking French over the phone had been barely coherent. He had all but begged me to take over the call, his usual bravado shattered. As my reputation within the company improved, Chris's standing took a nosedive. Once a manager, he was now seen as useless, drawing disappointed looks from the very people he used to belittle. Humiliated, Chris returned to his desk, his head in his hands. From that point on, any case requiring French communication was almost always directed to me. Occasionally, Chris would revert to his old arrogant behavior, but only when I wasn't around. However, none of the employees listened to him anymore. They had no respect for the former manager who couldn't even speak French properly. One day, after returning from an external visit, I caught Chris trying to hit on a new female employee. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, his excuses sounding more like childish whining than anything else. I leaned in and whispered, "I'm still in touch with Trevor." Chris's face went pale as he realized the implications of my words. Since the incident, there hadn't been any more trouble from Trevor's gang, likely because Trevor and his subordinates were keeping an eye on Chris. Chris collapsed onto his chair, shaking slightly as he stared off into the distance, all strength drained from his body. After that, he stopped his arrogant behavior entirely. Occasionally, he was even seen praising others, as if trying to reform his ways. Still, every time our eyes met, His face would contort and he'd break into a cold sweat. Years have passed since I first started working at the company. Sherry has since married and moved on. But I was promoted to manager, and now Chris is my chief. He has completely changed his ways and become considerate of those around him, even becoming a dependable member of my team. Having met Kevin and seeing people like Chris come to realize their mistakes, I've grown to believe that the world could be a better place if more people did the same. Having witnessed the darker side of humanity during my time in the Special Forces, my modest dream is for human conflicts to cease. It might seem naive, but Kevin and Sherry always took my idealistic ideas seriously. I continue to maintain a friendly relationship with Kevin's family. While I may not be capable of much, if I can change even a few people's perspectives and stop them from looking down on others, I'll have made good use of my experiences.